Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to Man's Hour, episode 55 on all male schools. I'm joined by a very esteemed guest. The one and only Mr. John D is returning to the show. How are you, sir?
Hello. I'm doing well. That theme tune has me, cupping my balls with anticipation. So
we could
that's
thank.
God. Is it? That's
It
God,
is
is it not?
Guard. Yeah, it is Guard. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, the man of many talents indeed. I'll tell you off air, but our good friend Charlemagne has commissioned Guard to do a piece, and it's gonna be pretty hilarious. I'll tell you off
I
air.
think I know exactly what it is. So yeah.
Oh, we were swapping ideas about it last night in a group chat. Oh man.
Okay. I have my guess about what it is. So
Yeah. But D, we are here to talk about all male schools and such. Now, people will recall your last appearance on the show when we discussed hierarchy and such, and I believe that that's a topic that will definitely be attached to this one, of course. But why don't you first start by giving us a brief overview here of your experience with all male schools and institutions and such, because I suspect there's definitely going to be some overarching themes here between our two experiences. But I mean, obviously, you're a little bit older than me, but also, I'm assuming you went to your school across the pond. Is that true?
yeah, but yes, partially. Because of the nature of my my upbringing and my parents' various affairs, I find myself in different places at different times. So yes, but certainly for the most part, my regular schooling, from where it can boarding schooling happened in the across the pond. So and again having to tiptoe through the land of facts. But yes, I am much older than you. So judging by appearance anyway. So being about 100 years older than you. Yeah, I mean things were quite different. I really caught the tail end of traditional schooling. In one way or the other. I mean, obviously things had changed because again I was going in the 80s, and again things had already sort of started to drift in a different direction. But there was still the sort of vestiges of the kind of system that people that are aware of how boarding schools and public schools work in Britain. Yeah, people will sort of have an idea of flavor of that. Because some aspects of it, I mean, even today, some aspects have not changed, but others, of course, have changed enormously. But yes, I attended all male schooling really up until I went to university. So
Yeah, I'm kind of I'm a bit of the opposite here. I had a public school education for elementary school, so like kindergarten through fifth grade over here, and then I was put into a Catholic school for middle school, which was co-ed, and then my high school I went to was all boys, was an all male school, and you know, my entire life growing up, I mean, I was always like a smart kid and such, but I didn't really want to put in too much effort, and I always hated the classroom and such. But I got to tell you, when I got to high school, it was like the first time in my life where I was actually excited to like go to school, because it was basically just it was like it was like a party every day basically. Me and my friends, when we get back together, we joke and we say it wasn't even real school, because it basically wasn't. It was just a locker room essentially the entire time. Everyone's making jokes and having a fun time, and we were a small class of around like 95 guys, so everybody knew each other pretty well by the time we got to the end of our schooling. So there was a lot of intense bonding that went on there. Would you say you had a similar experience with that? Like,
uh,
did you enjoy your time?
mm, I enjoyed aspects of it, obviously. Again, but I wouldn't say it was a wholly positive experience for me. Because I've always been a bit of oh, I don't know what the word. I've always had difficulty in it being sort of challenged in certain situations. So it really depended upon when you're talking about, um, that whether I found it, utterly enervating and boring, or whether, and just total hassle, or whether I found it a good experience. And also, it just depended upon, of course, the my my fellow boarders who were there with me, whether it was a good experience or not. I will say that, uh, the idea of sort of a sort of quote analogizing with a locker room, I think that's probably more of an American thing. Of course have an image of American sort of, what you call public schools. That's a bit of a confusing term, which I'll explain in a moment for people. But yeah, so I sort of have this sort of 80s movie sort of idea of American school, certainly coeducational ones. But I suppose, yes. I mean, there was certainly the camaraderie and those sorts of aspects of it I liked. There was also, of course, another layer earlier on, which again we can talk about in a bit, which is, I'm curious to know again if this is something you experienced in America, but this sort of slightly ritualistic, hierarchical aspect of school, which of course is something again that's famously associated with British public school, especially. Um, this sort of almost fraternal rights associated with how the students sort of organize themselves. So um,
Yeah, I don't remember. My mind goes to, I mean, a couple of movies are like what first drawn to my mind. That first of all, like the Dead Poets Society is obviously one that will come to somebody's mind in that degree, and then also National Lampoon's Animal House. Are kind of like the two, like two sides of this coin essentially.
yeah,
And yeah, there definitely were parts of that. I could tell, like, if I can describe it this way, when I was being taught by older faculty members who had been in my school for, a long time at this point, you could tell they definitely held on to those, traditions of hierarchy and such, like how people are supposed to behave. And they were talking about how things were done at the school before my time there. But by the time, I was finishing up there, and this is like the late 2000s, early 2010s, is when I finished up. And all that stuff was basically like we were the last legs, of it. And funny enough, like they switched headmasters shortly after I had left there. And the joke for the longest time was, it's like my class at the school was like the last true class, because then after that, they really started cutting back on things like dress code, things like shaving, whether or cutting your hair, tucking in your shirt, like how people are supposed to behave. They start slacking off on a bunch of that. And then, now my school's not even all boys anymore. It's a co-ed school now because, they want money.
yes, of course, that's that, and that is sadly the fate of so many of these types of institutions. And of course, depending on where you are, I mean, it will literally be, at some point it will run afoul of the legal apparatus, and it will be forcibly, um, co-educationalized. I'm quite surprised, given the sort of mania over equality, quote unquote equality, that it hasn't happened already. That any institutions managed to hold out against this eventuality. But it's certainly, most of them, most of the sort of great ones have certainly fallen uh, to this in one way or the other, as well as universities. I mean, people aren't aware, but it was not really that long ago that lots of the prestigious universities were also male only.
Yeah,
You,
Dartmouth was for like the longest time.
yeah, I mean, Yale University, I think, went co-educational in 1973. So something like that. So yeah, I mean, even in America, a lot of these institutions, the institution of sort of all male schooling, um, lasted a lot longer than people would like, even or people would imagine, even into yeah, as I said, university, and um,
Hmm.
so. But I think that um, there are a lot of reasons why, of course, this is an entirely negative um, thing that has come to pass. That the sort of fate of everything to turn into a kind of mixing pot of cultures and sexes and gender descriptions of all and sundry sort, which is again something that's now totally celebrated by um, most big institutions in Britain as well. You can't escape the rainbow, sadly,
Mm.
which is of course ironic because we can talk about that in a bit. But there is something about the culture. I mean, the same with the military. And in fact, a lot. I mean, certainly the schools that I attended, there was, even though they weren't military academies, they weren't military sort of schools, but that type of social arrangement was part of why they worked the way they did. I mean, and of course that instills something, and it creates an atmosphere that just you can't have in a coeducational institution at
R-
all. I mean,
Yeah.
modern people don't care. Again, they're just they've basically been sort of bred to forget how building an actual society works. So people don't even sort of consider this anymore. And of course, if you talk about all the advantages of these institutions, that it will even to many sort of ears sympathetic to to our general political side, they're going to automatically think of a lot of these things in terms of the negative. Again, when you sort of conjure up this image of aspects of these institutions, I just think people their minds immediately, they'd be trained to just go to think of all of it negatively. Oh, it's sadistic, it's militaristic, it's it's hierarchical. And again, we've all been sort of bred to think of those things as bad.
Yeah, absolutely. One common occurrence, at least for me, and you could speak on this too if this is something familiar you experience, but I think the best way I would describe like an experience attending one of these schools is the first of all, the behavior of all the boys and the men is completely different just simply because there's no women in the classroom. You have almost like the almost like the controlled experiment. If you were going to run like a science program, you got to test for control. This would literally be like the control of a male hierarchy is basically what it is. There's obviously a pecking order, like the stronger guys are going to be at the top, the more popular guys are going to be at the top, the sports stars or whatever, and it's going to go down from there. And of course, there's like jostling for position and such like that. But I would not describe that jostling for position and foundation of a hierarchy as anything remotely close to being like cruel or anything like that. It's not what it is because even though there were guys in that like in my class who I didn't necessarily get along with, or we weren't exactly, like buddy friends or anything like that, but I could have easily trusted that guy to have my back when we were at like a sporting event, like in facing off against the other school or something like that. Or if I ran into him like on the street or anything like that. Like there's a bond here that we're on the same team, even though we have disagreements or issues to some regard. Anything to add on that, D?
Yeah, I mean, so again, obviously, there was a very different thing that went on. So first of all, to define the term in in the UK, the term public school, so a public school um, is traditionally an institution which charges a fee for students. It's basically a boarding school, but it's called public in the sense that these schools are open um, to anyone who can pay, any students who can pay the fee,
Oh,
and they're not
I'm
run.
sure it's
They're not.
just I'm sure it's stock full of foreigners now.
It is, and not run for profit. This is not the same as the kind of what they used to call grammar schools. There are very few of those left. Um, um, but so I know that in America, a public school is basically just any sort of government run school. Is that true? Sort of.
Yeah, your public schools are what your tax dollars are directly funding. There's the public, which is the majority of the schools, and then you have the private ones, which are most always some form of religious affiliation attached to them.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so that's not the case. I mean, these public schools are sort of. I mean, a public school in the UK is a sort of elite institution. So people will know the most famous one being Eton, where an inordinate number of prime ministers, went through Eton,
Yeah, didn't
including
Boris Johnson go there?
yes, and he and many others. There's other ones, Harrow and Winchester, and um, I can't think of them all. Charterhouse. There's but
Well,
that's a very specific thing. So yes, public school has a very different meaning, and you often hear people sort of talk about the public school boy type. That used to be sort of
yeah.
slightly derogatory thing. It's basically saying rich, privileged
Mm,
boys. So
right.
and that's a sort of very common kind of thing uttered with derision by kind of media types. So that's certainly a difference. But also so British public schools and other kind of boarding schools, other kind of private institutions. They often there was a sort of arrangement whereby in order to kind of have order in the institution, the kind of management of the students was left partially to the upper sixth form students, like the older students, kind of
Mm,
ruled in an acknowledged hierarchy over the younger students, and they sort of, I mean, a lot of the kind of structure of the student body was sort of self-managed. Now
yes.
this again is going away because of course this is the whole thing that has been targeted. I mean, this thing was often known as fagging. People people can laugh, but it literally was what it was called, fagging. And of course there is some idea that certain other uses and derogatory uses of that term came from this system, but it was basically a
Mm,
system wherein the kind of older boys would form a kind of hierarchical structure and exact sort of discipline and order and regulation of the sort of goings on of the younger students. Now there would be there'd be a housemaster, there would be adults in the situation, but a lot of the kind of day-to-day management was conducted by the older students, themselves, and then the headmaster of the school would be very distant usually from all this. There was sort of
yeah.
the educational side, but then there was the whole social side, much of which was sort of controlled by older students. Now, of course, this, as with any sort of male order, natural sort of masculine order, I mean, men left to their own devices will automatically form one sort of hierarchy or the other. I mean, everyone will just sort of start to kind of fall into their place in a sort of structure, whether it's sort of very explicit structure, where there's kind of rules and regulations and this, but even just an informal structure, I think it's just something, of course, innate to the male of our species.
Hmm.
So this worked very well in some degree. Again, it was, as you said, it was sort of you know military training light.
Yeah, there was an order to it, and definitely, some harshness attached to it. One you were mentioning, how a lot of like I mean, we call them upperclassmen, like the older students, that was the name we would give for them, but they were like kind of de facto, in charge of things, so to some extent, they come up on a group of like freshmen or something doing something stupid and they're like, guys, is this really how we should be behaving? And not in like a scolding, like woman kind of way. It's kind of like, all right, fellas, I'll let you have a little bit of fun here, but don't let it get out of control. Like, come on. Uh, You know, like he understands where the guys are coming from. You know, it's not like a scolding position, like, oh no, this isn't something you shouldn't be doing. It's just like, you know, just tone it back a little bit. You know, put on a little bit of a performance here. You know, like you're not a bad guy, but come on, this isn't the time or place. You know.
Yeah, and of course, like any system, this can of course take different forms, and it can, obviously can be what people would call now abusive in one way or the other. I mean, this certainly the fagging. I mean, so this system called fagging was basically where younger students would act as the kind of servants for the upperclassmen, and
Oh yeah,
they would have to do
yeah.
chores, they would have to, wash their clothes, they would have to take care of this and that,
Very
and
common in the military. Yeah.
yeah, and again, it's just like the military. I mean, people will think, for instance, I mean, the example I can always give to people as a sort of echo of the system was the relationship in Lord of the Rings between Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee. You know, now that was slightly different because, of course, it was influenced by um, Tolkien's experience as a military officer. He had a sort of a servant as an officer would have, who sort of performed this role. It's something that is lost a little bit in the film. It's not as specifically hierarchical in the films as it is in the book, but
Yeah, he calls him Master Frodo in the books.
yes,
Yeah.
Master Frodo, and he is, he's clearly in a kind of role of a servant. Now, again, the modern mind immediately wants to sort of make this into an oppressive. You think about this as some sort of oppressive thing. It's not fair. Whatever. But I mean, it was just a perfectly natural order, and of course, one that I think you have to accept it. I mean, if you're going to, to sort of enter into the world of those books, but you find that sort of thing everywhere. I mean, it's certainly something that happens in the military, and it's sort of explicitly made part of how the military organizes itself altogether. You have officer classes, you have different classes, enlisted men, and
Mhm.
everyone has their place in that order determines what they're going to do, how they must behave. And the same thing used to happen in in boarding schools, public schools, in the UK. Now, this, as I said, for me, this was all still in place, but it was very soon to die out. By the end of the 1990s, this system was almost basically over. I mean, again, I don't know how things work now, but
Yeah.
it was again phased out because as the West descended into this sort of feminine therapeutic model, and everything became kind of pathology, and everything became a moment to kind of deconstruct oppressive things and free people from abuse and trauma. Then of course it had to go. That was the acid, the universal acid that dissolved all of these institutions.
Yeah. I have a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about here. Now, when I went to school, this is back when I was on the East Coast, and as people know, if you're on the East Coast, you will know that rowing is an extremely popular sport out there. And I was on a rowing team when I was at my school, and I'll never forget this. The upperclassmen, you were mentioning before about how like the guys at the top will order around the younger guys to do like chores and tasks and such on the team. And I think this is really important as to how male hierarchies function because there definitely is like a top dog. There's a guy in charge and you're below him and you get to do the grunt work. However, with that, position of, hierarchy, it's not so much that the guy is lesser as a person, it's just your skills are lesser at this time. So you need to be in this bottom of the rung position so you can learn these other things as to how this group and how this team functions. So when you are in this position of an upperclassman at some point, you know how to delegate tasks accordingly. So you got to start somewhere. You got to start at the bottom. So, you are your skills are useless, but that doesn't make you useless. And I feel like that's a big difference between like male and female hierarchies so much. Like women will almost take it as like a personal attack that I'm on the low rung of this thing, which I don't really think that's the case for guys. I think, It's kind of like a test run, if you will. Like if you could put up with this stuff, then okay, you're one of the guys, you're in the group now. But if you're going to complain about doing tasks and things, it's like, okay, well, now you've just signed up for more of them, and now nobody's going to like you. Like you have to take your beatings. And I'll have you come in a second, but this culminated in when I was a freshman, the upper class guys, we would always go down to Tennessee, in the wintertime to go and train for rowing because it was warmer and there was no snow on the ground. The ice had melted. So we'd take our spring breaks down in Tennessee. And when we were down in Tennessee, one of the boats lost to one of the other boats in a race. And the coach at our time was like, oh, okay, let's shave the losing team's heads, as a response to this. And everyone was like kind of joking and laughing about it. And eventually some of the guys did shave their heads. Well, this turned into the next day when all the upperclassmen came, broke into the rooms in the hotel of the other guys and forcibly shaved the heads of the younger guys. And this was a huge debacle at the school and ended up getting a bunch of guys suspended. The coach almost got fired. A bunch of moms got involved, my own included. And honestly, looking back on this, like I was one of the victims of this and really complained about it. And looking back on it now, it's probably not something I would have complained about today, just because, really screwed up the dynamics of letting, moms get in to call the school and have everybody's, heads on spikes, so to speak, because their sons got their heads shaved. But yeah, I mean, you were mentioning how this stuff is on its way out, and it basically was on, that was the last bit of it when I was there. Like when they had that occurrence, the axe came down.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And I think you'll find similar stories in many of these institutions. And of course, now you would be just arrested. The fucking police would storm your little room, and then the bad child would be dragged off to for the Ludovico treatment, where you have your eyelids pinned open and be forced to watch drag shows or something as punishment.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. Yeah, I mean, people, and then of course now everything is so legalistic and everything is so sort of codified in sort of state punishment that, yeah, I mean, you did any of this sort of thing. I mean, it's that sort of question I've heard people say, what if you transported a kind of 90s bully into modern schools? I mean, they would just be arrested and transitioned as punishment.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that's usually what happens. I mean, of course, and there's also, I mean, there's just as I said, there's a rise of this sort of therapeutic model of parenting. And now, of course, everyone is aware of. I don't want to sound callous, but it's almost as if there was a great blessing in the age where people didn't care as much about their children. There's a weird thing where children have been turned into sort of like luxury commodities.
Yeah, I think you're right.
That must be sort of groomed and protected from everything, and they must be sort of, there's just that there was a sort of different sort of way of dealing with children. And certainly in my family, which had all the kind of the way British class worked sort of dictated the relations in my family. But there was much more of a remove. Parents were generally not as sort of fanatically involved in life, in a child's life. Certainly not in my life, as they are now. So things would just sort of happen, and let the kids sort it out. They'll sort it out, and let the boys sort it out, and they did, some in nice ways or otherwise, But I mean, yeah, in certainly in the earlier part of my days, that incident wouldn't have caused a furore at all. So no one would have even heard about it. Maybe the housemaster, but
Yeah. And back to my example here, I mean, like, yeah, it kind of sucked, getting pinned down and having your head forcibly shaved by electric razors that were cutting into your scalp a little bit because you were struggling and, getting some blood on you and stuff like that. And yeah, it was a harrowing experience for, 14-year-old Red Hawk. But at the same time, like looking back on it, I was like, yeah, definitely probably overreacted to this. And it kind of like makes you think back to like just the world that we were raised in, and much of what we've been talking about here about how, like it's just we like to talk about the longhouse, but it really just is like the longhouse world. And thinking back on it now, it really is something that was just a huge overreaction and caused major problems, all the way through. But at the same time, it's like we're walking around the rest of the campus and such, and there's like, 25 guys that all have their heads completely shaved. It's like, well, we're all part of a team now. Like we're all part of this thing, at the same time. So
Yeah. I'm not condoning this because of course it can get out of hand. I mean, it certainly did. Um, I witnessed or was party to, depending on when you're talking about, of things that were certainly cruel and sadistic. I'm fortunately I have a bit of the I have a bit bit of the sadist bully in me as well. Or at least I did when I was younger. So I quite enjoyed being particularly cruel to people. But and of course, in retrospect, when one sort of matures, one can see that there have to be limits, just as there have to be limits in every sort of aspect of society. You can't let things go unchecked. There has to be the input. I mean, part of this hierarchy, it can't just be a hierarchy of like teenage boys. You know, because of a hierarchy, you need wisdom. You need wisdom from older males who are going to keep things from getting too brutal and too dangerous. But again, I think it works when that is part of again this male structure, this male hierarchy. The minute it starts to be like concerned mum coming in, it's going to take on a different character. And
yeah,
and again, I just think and that's what happens to everything. Everything. There can't be these kind of localized responses to things. Everything has to be a giant, a giant universal circus with everyone weighing in and everyone sort of exacting their own sort of justice upon wrongdoers. And it just makes everyone paralyzed. Everyone is afraid to do anything because of course what will come down on you if one or the other aggrieved groups decide to do it. So when it was again local to the organization or to the group or to the confraternity, whatever, and it was controlled by, as I said, a hierarchy of wisdom and strength and virtue, then it can work and it doesn't get out of hand. It doesn't take on that sort of Lord of the Flies quality, which of course
mhm,
happens. I mean, that's
yeah,
that's all true, and certainly children, young people will resort to savagery if they're not guided. They will revert to a sort of savage state towards each other. So there is danger here, but of course in a society that isn't out of control, that isn't unbalanced, that isn't decaying away, there will be controls that sort of keep things in order. But again, we've gotten rid of that. That
yeah.
there are no controls except for the law.
Yeah, we've traded a, functional hierarchy for all its flaws that it might have. At least it was functional and, made to fit for design. And we've now traded it for a panopticon, basically, which is like, it's like, okay, well, you're safe, but at what cost? It's like, so now the complete functionality of this group and this hierarchy that has had, traditions and ways of behavior and codes of conduct and all these other things passed down for generations and years of guys, and it's now just infected with this foreign agent that really just doesn't belong there. It's like, okay, well, it's now safe, and maybe a couple people have benefited from this, but at the cost of the entire group. It's like, I don't think so. Not a good
Y-
idea.
y- Yeah, indeed. And of course, we haven't really touched on it, but the educational part of all of this, I mean, it's also implicated in this. It is well known that boys and girls have entirely different styles of learning. They have entirely different styles of behavior. They have their attention is directed in very different ways. And again, it's partially a kind of it's the sort of inherent tendencies of the sex that sort of dictate how these things work. and you know, as we have seen, when you know when education is sort of co-education, when it's co-educational situation, it will of course immediately lurch towards towards the feminine style, because of course girls can't handle the kind of masculine style. It's just totally unsuited to them. And of course, who is teaching? Well, uh it's majority female teachers, and has been for a very long time. Certainly, in America, I don't know. I'd have to look at the statistics, but so when boys are placed in a sort of feminine framework, which is of course the modern classroom, it can be disastrous for them. I mean, the last thing, it's this idea of the pace you're going to be learning. Everything is sort of directed towards group activities in a certain way. This sort of, uh, sit still and be quiet and stop fidgeting. And, it's just, again, the whole structure of the actual teaching changes when you have a mixed dynamic, which is why, of course, I think in certainly in Britain and perhaps in America, I mean, there has been a kind of concurrent movement to kind of bring back sex segregated schooling and school, sort of uniform, having a dress code, which is very common in British schools, probably less so in America.
Yeah, definitely no. Yeah.
But I mean, people have, at least some people have sort of seen and learned subtle lesson here. But and of course, I think it's also feeds into why so many children, especially boys, are medicated from a very young age. They're
Yes.
basically medicated out of being male, because of
Mhm.
course, their primary duty is to be quiet and sit with and listen to his, sort of liberal cat lady, tell
Yeah.
them about tell them about John Brown or something.
Yeah. The other thing too about this, and my mind went to this, is that not only do boys and girls learn things differently, but they also need to be what's called like socialized and reined in differently as well. My mind goes to something like discipline, which is something that my school was huge on, particularly if you were sent to after school detention, as it were. It was rough, it was brutal. They had a dean of discipline at the school. He'd walk right in. When you're sitting in the classroom, he's like, get up, stand in front of that wall and look at it for 2 hours. Just make people stand at the wall, like not move or anything. Or he'd get out like a dictionary and force you to write page after page in the dictionary. And I had one circumstance where I was writing while looking at the dictionary, but also like not looking at my sheet of paper because I was just trying to get it done as fast as possible. And he pulled me aside, covered up like 6 letters of this 7-letter word, and just had the one letter standing out. He's like, "What is this letter?" And I just had to like completely guess and throw a shot in the dark because, of course, it was written horribly and like complete trick and scratch. I happened to be lucky and got it right, and he let me go home. But it's like, yeah, you got to discipline guys differently than you do girls. You need that big, strong dude to come in and basically say, take control of the situation and knock you down a couple pegs.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious. So again, you being American and younger than me, what was corporal punishment still practiced when you were at school? I mean, could you be sort of paddled or
Um,
caned?
it definitely not in an official sense. Absolutely not. No,
Okay.
but there were cases of guys like getting picked up and being forcibly removed from the classrooms. There was one case where a guy was tossed out the first like story window out to the bushes, like 6 feet outside the door,
Wow.
outside the window, or getting like a slap upside the head. But this was like one of those things where it was like just really, really hush hush about it. Like nobody was really talking about it, any of those things. So definitely not in an official sense, but it did still occur with some degree of rarity, and really only in circumstances where like all the other guys in the class as well as like everybody else in the room was like, oh yeah, this kid totally deserved it. He was acting like a fuck. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Curious because yeah. I wonder about this. Again, this is something that I don't know if it existed in America, but there was certainly there was in Britain up until a certain point. There was not so much in government schools. There was a sort of physical aspect to kind of punishment, and of course this was easily meted out by again the older students against younger students or uncooperative members of their own members of their own class. Um, you know, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know how effective those things are, but it's certainly true. At risk of coming under 99 and Duke's ire, but I suspect that this was also a part of various militaries up until a certain point. I mean, I always think fondly to Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. I mean, the first section of that film depicting the um, oh, can't think of the
Like
character's
the
name, but Arlie Emery and and the
Private
draftees
Snowball.
or
Yeah.
recruit Snowball and yeah, and all of that, and I mean, in a way that was that was certainly how things worked in the military of old, in Britain as well. You know, I mean, lashings and canings and things like that. I mean, it had a much more brutal character. But again, when you start having a group that is not entirely sort of insular and homogenous, so in a situation where you're drafting, having military draft, you're going to start getting certain men that aren't of the sort of character of the rest of the group and who may
Oh,
react
yeah.
in a
I
different way. I'm trying to skirt around the fact that, of course, this has also happened in school, where suddenly, where once you had an entire classroom full of white British boys or American boys of a homogeneous nature, and suddenly you're forced to integrate that educational situation with other types of males from different groups and different
Yeah,
upbringings.
yeah, we're definitely at that point in this stream here. We're past the first 30 minutes and we could talk about this. I mean, at my school, this again, like it's so strange. I really just was there like the perfect time apparently because like you could still get away with this stuff and you could see, like the reports from the ground, that these things were changing. But at my school, it was traditionally, like entirely, entirely white, but in the time that I went to my school, they started drafting in more and more and more black guys and people from the Middle East as well into my school. Number one, because like the Middle Easterners would pay more and the blacks were good at sports, and they started bringing in more and more and more of these guys, and the groups were just not as homogenous as they used to be for obvious reasons because in-group preference is just simply something you can't educate out of people. It's just always there, and this ended up resulting in other problems where the school would have like after school activities like picnics or fairs like where families would show up and such, and a lot of those have gone away now because roaming gangs of youth would show up to the school events and cause problems, and it got to the point where it was too expensive for police presence to be at these events, so they just canceled all the events now. So it's
Yep.
tragic.
Yeah, absolutely, and of course there's a flavor of that that's happened in the UK as well, with different types of youths, but youths nonetheless. So those pesky youths. But it is interesting, of course, that it's not just, of course, I mean, yes, sex segregation and education, I think certainly produces better outcomes for society, but there's also a component that requires a consistency amongst the males in those institutions and it would be a very different experience today. I mean, again, I don't know what happens in in public school today, because there's, as you say, they're half Chinese at this point. But most,
Yeah.
certainly the ones in Britain are, you know.
Hmm.
So, and it's just it's very difficult to have a cohesive social structure when, half of the students are just from a completely alien culture. Just that's just as sort of corrosive a thing as sort of introducing females into these classes. So,
Well, yeah,
um,
and of course when you introduce, I mean, definitely in the context of America, I know this is slightly different in the UK because like the population from India and the UK scores much higher than the urban population in America. But and of course, the academics naturally started to take a downturn as a result of that. I mean, the school became more focused on sports as opposed to academics, which on the face of it, I'm not necessarily opposed to because much of the academics that they teach people in schools today is hogwash anyway. But it is like an overall sign of I guess the decline, for lack of a better word, where in the past, yes, sports were stressed to an extreme degree and are obviously important for all young men to engage in. But when it comes to the point where you spend like $3 million on a football field or something like this, and you're constantly sending people to, the pro leagues and everything, it's just like, what really are you focusing on? I mean, at my school, people used to go to mass every single day at the crack of dawn, and then they dialed it back to two days a week. And now I think they only do it one day a week now
oh,
at this school. So,
okay.
uh,
Yeah. Religious services is also something that I had, which has gone out. For a very brief period of time, you want to talk about brutality? If you ever find yourself being taught by nuns, um, I don't know. I don't know if you've been
yeah,
in that situation.
yeah.
For a brief period of my youth, I find myself in that situation. Good Lord. Um,
Yeah, I got
yeah.
slapped in the face by a nun once, and I didn't
Oh,
even I actually didn't even do anything. It wasn't even my fault. It literally was somebody else, and she thought that I did it. She apologized to me afterwards. It was like it wasn't me.
lol.
Uh,
Uh, but the sport thing, I don't understand at all. I mean, that is something that doesn't happen in Britain. The American football thing doesn't make any sense to me at all.
yeah,
I don't.
it's definitely an
Yeah.
American thing. Like the
No.
American professional sports thing is just it's on a whole another level compared to like the
Yeah.
rest of the world. I mean, professional sports basically were as we know them now were invented in America, so it's got a deep hold here.
Yeah. I mean, it's an industry, and of course, these things. I mean, you can look back. I mean, I know that certainly in the universities in America, you know, the Yale Harvard game was a big deal back in the 19th century. You also had military sport teams, and you'd have Army Navy game. I know was a
Hmm.
thing. Probably still is a thing. I don't
Yeah, it
know.
still goes on. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that was important before it became professionalized. Sport it's a different thing in Britain. Now, I am of the minority opinion that what you call soccer, football, is an ethnic foreign import into Britain that doesn't belong, and it took over British sort of public life in a way that's just entirely unnatural. I'm all return to cricket, return to rugby. I hate football, soccer. And again, I do, I think it's an external pathogen, but that's another subject for
I
another
think
day. But
that is an interesting topic, and I think, like, just hearing it right now, I think I would be inclined to agree with you on that front. I mean, I've said for a long time that, I mean, there's a reason why soccer is always, there's a reason it's the quote unquote most popular sport in the world. Well, it's kind of like the poor man's sport. I mean, all you need is four rocks and a ball, you know.
yeah, yeah,
So,
it's
yeah, it's
it's a
not
sport
something
for
you expect, the British Empire guy who's ruling over, India and the Maharaja, to be importing soccer. You definitely expect him to have a little bit more of a, I don't know, to quote like the Joker from The Dark Knight, a better class of, sport,
yeah, yeah, certainly. No, I've never understood it. It seems like a game for brown people, but that's been my but well, I mean, of course, evinced by, I mean, look at how different different populations, look at how mental they go. Take Brazil or Italy. I mean, look at how mental they go over it, and there's always this struck me as somewhat foreign and out of place in Britain, but whatever. But no, we don't have that sort of professional sport thing. Certainly not in British public school. That type of environment. Now there is sport, and it was very important. And in fact, there's the old idea of that British officers learnt everything they needed to know on the playing fields of Eton. That through by playing games, and doing sport, physical culture was an essential part of 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 the British public schools, boarding schools, and it again was still when I was there. I always quite like that aspect of it. I think that's certainly changed, and of course you're going to get different situation when as soon as you introduce females into an institution of that nature, then it just the games have to take on an entirely different character. But
Yeah.
certainly, again, part of learning how to be a man, how to organize human endeavor, you get the kind of microcosm of it, in learning how to organize, again, your sort of domestic life at boarding school, and also by learning how to deal with sport, how to deal with that sort of rivalry, because as I said, it is a sort of microcosm for larger and different types of conflicts later on. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. These institutions are absolutely necessary, training wheels essentially for, the rest of your lives as men, dealing with groups of men, which traditionally would have been, things like politics, the workplace, anything like this, where again, women traditionally were not involved in, so you kind of had to learn how to, you know, socialize properly with other groups of men and such. And, as soon as you like have a female enter the room in one of these institutions, the entire dynamics change immediately. I have an example of this when we had the option to take like collegiate level classes basically, because it was a huge campus, and the one of the buildings on the campus was also like had like a partnership with a local university. So like we had the option to, when we were seniors, like, oh, okay, go take like a college level class, and it can work with college credit when you go on to college. And in these classes, you would occasionally have women show up in these classes because it's literally like collegiate level course, so some women would come from like a local community college and show up. And there was a biology class I took, 26 guys, one girl, and the one girl totally set off. The dynamics were completely different. The guys were, and she wasn't even that attractive either, but that's besides the point. It was just guys are constantly jostling like back and forth with each other to get in the good graces with the women, not even always intentionally as such, but it's just like, oh, look at me, I'm the big swinging dick in the room, I'm the best guy, to attract this girl kind of deal. And you really just can't turn this off. It's really not possible.
yeah, that's certainly a very important point to bring up. Is of course there's a whole sexual dynamic in these situations, and of course that was one of the sort of great points in favor of not having coeducational experiences, because of course immediately you introduce a female into a group of men. I mean, whether they want to or not, most of them will start, as you say, vying for a position in regards to this female. They will, and it's amazing to watch it happen. I mean, I have long argued against bringing females into any sort of male space. It even happens online. You know, um,
Yeah.
like if you have a bloody group chat that's all men, and a woman is introduced. everything inevitably breaks down.
It's literally like the Elmo, "This house is on fire" meme.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
weird. It's so weird how it happens. And again, men, I mean, they can't, we can't help ourselves. Well, uh, the royal we can't
Yeah.
help ourselves in that situation. You know, now it gives me the opportunity to very delicately and very briefly bring up another aspect that's famously associated with British boys' educational institutions, which is that occasionally the sort of hierarchical dynamic will take on a psychosexual character.
Mm,
And of course, if you think of all male spaces, this happens elsewhere. I mean, one thinks of prisons, again, one
yeah.
thinks of to some degree of the military. And of course, this is over exaggerated by the by the generous media, but it did happen. And of course, this is, I think, a darker aspect of again, the character of it uh, is not solely sexual.
No,
It also it
it's
has
not Rainbow Flag. It's not what it is.
no, no. And I mean, this is where people are often quite confused because of my utter hatred and revulsion of all things gay. Because that's, again, it's of a totally different character. I mean, there is an ancient aspect of male hierarchy that can take on the character of sexual violence, or hierarchical sexuality. So this does occasionally happen, and certainly did. Of course, that is another thing that has been stamped out.
R-
But
Right.
you put a woman into this situation, of course, and again, it's going to go totally haywire, even if it's not, as you say, a particularly attractive woman. You know,
Yeah,
um,
exactly. I mean, any port in a storm, right? it's literally how guys it's literally how guys brains think on this regard. But
yeah, yes, and it will find an outlet, in one way, or the other. And of course there will be traditional sort of outlets for this kind of thing.
mhm.
Uh,
Well,
even sort of outside of the rules, there will be an unspoken sort of nod to to the sort of prevalence of prostitutes and things of that nature. I mean, there is, of course, always going to be, when you start to get into the sort of realm of repressed instinctual urges, there's always going to be a dark side to that.
yeah, the other thing to this as well, and someone who talks about this a lot, and actually his most recent podcast covered this in great detail, is Bronze Age Pervert. And uh one of there's like grades to this thing. Like there's a difference between guys in a locker room, and you know what, this is gonna get taken out of context no matter what we say, so we might as well just talk about it as a grown ass adults here. But there's a difference between like guys in a locker room, and one guy just walks right into the room with his dick hanging out, basically to like assert the dominance, basically, for lack of a better word. And then there's an actual, far side of this where there's actual, homosexual acts being taken place, or like the towel kind of thing, that is always characterized by these things. Like guys rat tail somebody else and hit him on the ass with a towel or something, or you even see this in like guys who are like really, really like good friends, so, this, you see this all the time in like football. Like the guy gets like a pat on another dude's ass or something like this. Like
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
there's grades to these things. You know.
And this is, and again, this is something else that the whole notion of gay as a sort of identity has sort of erased from civilization, which is again just another distressing thing. I mean, men are also, they're physical with each other in a kind of martial sense, but also, in an intimate sense. I mean, it will often shock people, and again, modern people have been so poisoned to think of everything in terms of kind of an manifestation of a sexual preference, or
Yeah.
whatever, that, but you can find, it was common practice in many British public schools and other situations as well for boys, younger boys, to hold hands when they were walking about. You know, there was we had nothing. It had no sexual character whatsoever. It had no sort of implication of sexuality, and you can find hundreds of photographs of this. I mean, just 60, 70, 80 years ago, this was just common practice. And you still see this if you've ever gone to certain places in the Middle East. You will still see men, grown men, holding hands or being sort of more physically affectionate with each other. But now, of course, when everything becomes characterized as a sort of manifestation of a preference or an identity, men are afraid. They're afraid that any sort of that you delve into the sphere at all, that they're going to be marked. They're going to be called gay. They're going it's all going to be characterized that way. And so it's just taken on a whole sort of neurotic tenor where just men are just like mortified and about having any sort of kind of physical intimacy of that nature. And it's necessary. I mean, I think we had to I mean, for instance, you had to shower. We at certain institution we had communal shower, and of course
Yeah.
but there just was no thought about this. And now I think it would cause a psychological crisis in a lot of young men to be naked in each other's presence. Whereas it's a totally natural thing. If you were swimming, if you were again dressing in any sort of communal situation, it's I think one thing that also boarding school, it used to it could disinhibit men around each other, which is important. You have to be able to do that, and certainly again in a military context, that's really important because you've got to have a kind of tight cohesion amongst the group. There has to
Yeah.
be a sort of total dedication to each other, which of course is broken when you start introducing women into squads, into schools. You start introducing, transsexuals, whatever. You're just not going to be able to have that cohesion any longer. So,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I see we're getting pushback from people in the chat here. Again, like we're just describing things like as they are. We're nobody's making like absurd like endorsements here or anything like this. We're just describing like simple fact of the matter. And the simple fact of the matter is you saw this in hyper masculine spaces all over, like in places like the Middle East. You see out in ancient Greece, ancient Rome. Like again, people can go check out BAP's most recent podcast. He does like a 3-hour breakdown of this, and it's very informative. But again, like we really are tainted by modernity with a lot of these discussions, as with literally everything else we talk about, as it relates to like tradition or our past or anything else. It's important to get out of a 2023 mindset when talking about these kinds of things, because like they do occur. And like I'm not making endorsements like therein, but I'm just saying like this is just part of the package. Masculinity isn't like a buffet you can just go and sample dishes from at your pleasing. No, it's a package, and this just happens to be a part of the package.
indeed, and of course, it's difficult to sort of perceive it unless you sort of really think about things from afar. But our entire civilization since the Victorian era, I would say, and maybe even slightly before that, has adjusted itself to become a female space. Where I mean, for me, the whole idea of sort of politesse, manners, being restraining your speech, sort of filtering what you say, watching what you think, all of that was sort of again the advent of or the innovation of women into all spheres of public life. So again, so there you think back on the Victorians, there was this sort of concomitant sort of move to let's make society polite for all the women who are now a part of it. And so, of course, I think that this style then became so prevalent that people don't even see it. But I think it's essentially kind of feminine way of being, where you can't talk frankly about these things because
No, I
just
mean,
people get up in arms, they get uptight.
yeah,
Oh my god, you know.
yeah. Oh my God! Like a guy in a sporting team, punched his buddy in the balls and watched him fall on the floor and laughed at him, because like he caught him. It's like, oh, okay, therefore this makes this guy like a flaming, rainbow these days. It's like, no, this is not the case, and I understand like it makes people, uncomfortable and like the hairs on the back of their head like raise up with this stuff. But again, like you get these kinds of behaviors in any hyper masculine space.
Yeah.
You don't see like girls in girls' locker rooms running over and like punching women in the vagina. It just doesn't happen. But
Well,
this happens like
no,
all the
that's true,
time.
but yeah, it's true. But
Yeah.
women, but don't don't be misled because women have their own savage form of hierarchy, which they are merciless when exacted upon each other. So, um, but it's of a very different character. But yeah, I mean, even beyond the kind of intimacy or sociosexual kind of thing, but just in general, I mean, consider the field of politics, which is one of the most feminine. Modern politics is one of the most
Yeah.
feminine spaces ever devised by the mind of man. I mean, it would have made the Amazon women, a bit embarrassed. Where everything that you say, you cannot talk frankly about anything. You cannot talk frankly about any sort of issue, any sort of topic. You can't. You everything has to be filtered through this, overweening feminine superego, that you really end up not being able to say or do anything at all. And to me, I always associate this with, again, the feminization of every space. And
Mm.
you can say that. Oh, I mean, yes, all of this. Well, D is just a woman hating fag. But it's not it's about recognizing that men and women have different styles, different proclivities, different instincts, and we need a society that has spheres that allow men and women to express those strengths in their own way and not hammer everyone into the same round hole with the same square peg. That's the problem.
Well,
It's not. And of course, it's, I think, the crux of what happened to all these institutions. Anyway, sorry.
yeah. Well, there's a there's a concept in the like what we talk about in the manosphere and the RP. We have the two parenting strategies, and the father, his parenting strategy is very rules based. There's a set rules he sets in front of them. Some of them you can kind of twist and play with a little bit. Some rules you can stretch a little bit more. They're not as as important as other ones, things like this. But the woman's parenting strategy is almost always emotion based. It's like because like women's emotions are fluctuating. It's like, okay, I have to do something to please this specific person as opposed to following the letter of the rules. And you kind of are seeing this when we're talking about this entire conversation here about how like the emotional side of it, like the judging side of it and all this stuff is, what so often comes with it and what is attached to all these conversations, when instead it's like, okay, we're guys, we acknowledge that, certain things exist. We have a set of rules. We have other rules that are enforced, some that are, a little less enforced or things like this. But it's much more matter of fact and much more practical, and also like less like bickering and judging back and forth. It's just like, oh, okay, all right, this is the way things are. We got to address things accordingly. And I think that speaks to a lot of what you're talking about here. It's just how everything just has to be, a prescription. Everything has to be advice. Everything has to be emotive. Everything has to be like a call to action or an endorsement whenever anyone talks about something. Like, can we just like talk about the truth? Can we just find the truth?
No, we can't, because of course
Yeah.
women aren't interested in the truth at all, and they never have been. Again, it's just different. They have their minds are made up in a very different way. Now, of course, to make the situation even worse, I realize we're drawing close to the end. I don't want to drop any sort of monstrous black holes, but so even femininity today is, of course, of a totally different character, because you take, of course, the natural emotional proclivities of women and you saturate it with artificial hormones, psychoactive psychoactive drugs, SSRIs. I mean, you make this chemical stew that women have been soaking in for the past 50 years or more, depending on when birth control, sort of came in, and you get an even worse situation. You get all of these natural characteristics which can be funneled into, the most positive of things, the rearing of children being one of the most important, and it's all out of control. And we just take a bad situation and make it worse. So I do think it's very difficult to even judge the true character of modern people, men to some extent, but I do think that the birth control hormones have played a very disastrous part in the changing of the female character. So I don't even know. It's difficult to even sort of think about what how things would be different about this. So
yeah, indeed. Well, D, I got to run over to the OGC show here at the top of the hour. So as much as I have enjoyed this conversation and always enjoyed talking to you, we will have to wrap up, unfortunately. So do you have anything to promote, sir?
I don't. I have no idea when Unpopular Opinions is going to return. I have no idea when we're doing the next part of the last part of the Francis Bacon streams, art streams that I've been doing on Academic Agent's channel, because there's been some scheduling problems. So I can't promote anything. I mean, if people are curious about watching the previous installments of this art stream, you can find them on AA's channel. That I've been doing with Alexander Adams, but and whenever UO happens again, I suppose I'll be there. But
yeah, with the new cast of characters, I see he's doing one of his season shakeups. Yes.
Yeah,
yeah, I know.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I know some of the lads already, and they're quite good. A Walrus and others, but it's yeah, there's a distinct absence of young Americans, which I think is a shame. So I'll exercise my influence to get some of my my new Yankee. I shouldn't say Yankee. I get beat up every time I am
a Yankee.
You're
sadly,
a Yankee, okay.
But yes.
I'll see if I can get a few of you fellows on there, because nothing worse than listening to the Brits prattle on about things. But anyway, thank you very much. For having me. I'm always happy to talk to you.
Yeah, indeed. And you guys can look for Mr. D's famous Twitter Spaces on Twitter as well, where I tend to frequent from time to time, and we have fun discussions on those as well. But the only other thing I will promote here, of course, is the Old Glory Club stream, which is kicking off in 5 minutes. So go over to the OGC channel and hear about us talk about the goings on in American news, which is just full of white pills these days. Patriots are in control. We'll be back in charge any moment. D, of course. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone in the chat. Oh, wait, I do have one super chat we got to mention really quick. $5 from Nico. RP Bucks for RP Hawk. Thank you very much, sir. Looking forward to the show. You mentioned on X about the religious stuff. Many dudes finger wagging because they know nothing else. Yes, I think I have the perfect person to ask for this, and I think our good friend, Not Me, Not You, will be perfect for that stream. I'm going to go talk to him about that, so maybe we'll do that next week. But thank you for coming on, D. Thank you, everyone in the chat. Undoubtedly, there will be some comments under this one, but who cares? Thank you, D, and we will talk soon.